Now, first, I've talked a lot already about aligning risks with objectives, so I won't necessarily repeat all that. But I will say if you're building an ERM program, an enterprise risk program, then this is one of the foundational best practices from ISO 31000. And as we discussed, a good thing to do is implementing a risk appetite framework, as a helpful way to prioritize risks and give business context to your leadership team. Now, the challenge, I'm going to come back to this complexity idea. The challenge with risk appetite is it can get really complex. And there is certainly value in some of the more sophisticated approaches, but I really can't tell you how many times I talk to organizations who say they're planning to implement risk appetite, but they just never get there. An approach that we recommend is to start with something simple that you can use right away. You can get most of the benefits, and it'll help you engage the stakeholders and have those really useful conversations early on. Now, I think Guggen's going to show you an example, but in summary, one approach is to work with your leadership team to set tolerance ranges for your residual risk scores in each of your risk categories. It's a pretty simple approach, but you get all the benefits of having the discussion and establishing the concept with your management. And by implementing this as like an easy kind of like training wheels approach, your users will get comfortable with the concept. And if you want to get more sophisticated later, you can. As we discussed in the pitfalls section, you want to choose your terminology and labels carefully. You want to avoid jargon and pick common language that makes sense to the contributors and stakeholders that you're going to be relying on. Now, this is another area where linking risks to objectives can help. I saw a really cool example where an ERM manager basically just flipped the terminology of her entire program. Instead of calling the activity risk management, she relabeled it as enterprise strategy. And she described the risk activities in terms of contingency planning and testing assumptions. Now, it's just a simple little tiny change, but it made all the difference for her in terms of getting acceptance among the business people. I mean, they understood that they had a role to play in hitting objectives, and contingency planning and assumption testing didn't carry into the negative baggage for them that the words like risk, control, and compliance did. So changing terminology is an easy thing to do, but it's often not obvious to a lot of risk nerds like me, because we can really get attached to our terminology. And so again, it's such a simple thing, but a lot of risk managers like myself can miss that if we don't sort of stop and think about our stakeholders and the language they use. Number 4, it's really hard to establish, it's really helpful rather, to establish the concept of risk ownership. And ideally, this gets done at the level of a named individual. Now, sometimes you'll see risk ownership assigned to a position or a department, but it is most effective when it can be an individual person. I mean, this is really what drives attention and accountability. It's just like project management. Nothing sharpens your focus like having your name on something. And as we discussed earlier, risk is just part of doing business. You can't separate it. So if you're the individual who has responsibility for operations or a project or a strategic objective, then you also own the contingencies, or the risks that come along with it. And putting names on risks is a best practice towards getting buy-in on this concept in your organization. And once you do this, you can reposition yourself as an advisor or facilitator who's there really to help them achieve their objectives. And finally, and most importantly of all, is to start small and get quick wins. There's a tendency in risk management to want to plan the perfect program, or the perfect risk framework before we roll it out. And as we've said before, I mean, we get to see how many organizations approach risk management. And I can tell you, the organizations that start small and get these quick wins and then adapt through a learning-based process, these organizations end up getting there faster than the over-planners. And when I say getting there, what I mean is getting strong buy-in from stakeholders and contributors, and then building that healthy risk management culture that they're looking for. And in contrast, what happens is the excessive planners, they don't seem to get there as often or as quickly rather, and sometimes they don't get there at all. Like in an organization, sometimes you get these unique or short windows of opportunity that open up where there's an appetite and an openness to implementing risk management. You've got this really limited time horizon to get some quick wins, establish the buy-in that you're going to need to carry you forward. So you don't want to waste that precious time by trying to get everything perfect. And on the other side is, once you get some quick wins, it's a lot easier to add in extra things over time as everybody's comfortable with the process. The apprehension is gone, they see value. And if you start out positioning the fact that it's going to be this iterative learning-based process, then you'll find that people will be open to and they'll be tolerant of the fact that changes are going to come. So again, maybe obvious, but it's not how a lot of risk programs go, and we certainly see a really big difference in organizations that take this iterative learning approach.